Hello again, grade 7s. In today's lesson, we are going to look at data that is presented in a circle graph. And then using the data presented in the circle graph, we're going to try to interpret that data. The learning outcome is just that, to interpret circle graphs to solve problems. A circle graph is a graph that represents data using sectors of a circle. The sum of all percentages in a circle graph, if you take all your sectors as a percentage and add them up, it should be equal to 100%. Okay, let's make sense of this by looking at an actual circle graph. So this graph could be perhaps a survey that was performed in a class where students were asked to vote on their favorite sport. And then what the graph does is it shows the percentage of students who voted for a particular sport. So I'm going to focus on one of these little pieces of pie inside the graph. So let's go to baseball. Let's just shade this little section in right here. This little piece of pie on a circle graph is what we call a sector. If you take every sector, and if it tells you what percentage is in that sector and you add them all up, it must be equal to one whole. And one whole would be equal to 100%. Okay, so let's go through an example now to just perform some calculations and actually interpret the data. So 300 students are asked to fill out a survey regarding what sports they play. And I want to determine how many students play hockey, how many more students play soccer than volleyball, and how many students do not play baseball. Okay, so if you look at the circle graph, I know that 35% of 300 students play hockey. To calculate how many students actually do play hockey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that percentage and turn it into a decimal. So to go from a percentage to a decimal, you can just divide by 100, which is the same thing as taking your decimal spot and moving it 1, 2 over to the left. And that would give me 0.35. When you find a percentage of a number, what you're doing is you're multiplying. So that would be 0.35 multiplied by 300. We can plug this into our calculator, and if we do that, we would get that 105 students play hockey. So fairly simple calculation. Now B says how many more students play soccer than volleyball? Well, first of all, let's figure out how many play soccer, and then how many play volleyball, and then we can figure out the difference between those two numbers. So for soccer, I know that 25% of 300 students play soccer. Let's turn this into a decimal. So 25% as a decimal would be 0.25. Of is multiplication. So we go 0.25 multiplied by 300. And when you find 25% of a number, you're just finding a quarter of it. A quarter of a number is the same thing as taking that number and dividing by 4. So if you took 300 and you divide it by 4, you would get 75. Okay, so 75 students play soccer. Now let's figure out how many play volleyball. Okay, so if I look at the circle graph, it tells me that 10% of my students play volleyball. So 10% of 300. When you take 10% and convert it into a decimal, it would be 0.10. And then we're going to multiply that by 300. When you find 10% of a number, it's the same thing as taking that number and dividing by 10. So 300 divided by 10 would be equal to 30. Okay, so now how many more play soccer than volleyball? We'll just need to subtract these two numbers. We would just go 75, subtract 30, would be equal to 45. More students. Play volleyball. In comparison to soccer. Okay, so let's box that. And the last one says, how many students do not play baseball? Okay, we know that 10% of the students play baseball. So 10% of the students play baseball would be represented by this sector here, or this section. So all other sectors would represent the number of students who do not play baseball. So I want to figure out what the percentage of students who do not play baseball would be. Well, the way we can do that is we can take the total percentage of the circle graph, which is 100% for the whole graph, and then subtract the number of students who do not play, or who do play baseball. And this would tell me that 90% do not play baseball. And now we can just perform the calculation to determine how many actual students don't play the sport. So I know that 90% of my total population in this survey of 300 do not play baseball. Take 90% and convert it into a decimal, and that would be 0.90. When you find a percentage of a number, you multiply. So you go to 0.90 times 300. .90 times 300 would be 270. So we'd have 270 students do not play baseball. Okay, and we'll just box that. And that's it. Most of the interpretation of a circle graph is just going to involve finding out the percentage of some kind of total number. So as long as you're capable of doing that, then the work shouldn't be too bad. And the work you can practice is on pages 290, 291, numbers 3 through 8. And then I will talk to you in the next lesson, where we'll wrap up the unit of study on circles by dealing with some word problems. And I'll talk to you then.